With a focus on advancing emergency care, Zoll delivers innovative, user-friendly technology designed for where and how you work, and for the patients who rely on the care you provide. Zoll is committed to helping you save more lives.
Thank you. I know it's always dangerous talking after lunch, so since we're going to talk about cardiac arrest, I figured maybe a first starting point would be just turn to your neighbor, see if they're breathing, check a pulse. Okay, we'll do a pulse check at the end. I know 20 minutes, we'll try to cover a lot of material. For those that were here yesterday, Jerry Nolan started off and gave a great talk. And I know our titles are very similar, but I really point out he talked about top 10 strategies to improve radical hospital cardiac arrest. And really I'm going to focus on metrics. And the idea is, having strategies, you really need to have metrics to understand if those strategies are working. And really track performance over time. This concept of measure and improve, though very basic, is very important. And as we talked about, the ability to collaborate and to live here for a year and work with a lot of the Peros investigators was really a great opportunity for me to see. It's been very exciting to see how a lot of communities globally are beginning to understand, if you want to really strengthen the chain of survival, it's not about the next drug, it's not about the next device, it's really about doing the basics well, and arguably if you don't have measurement, you really don't have a starting point to understand how to improve upon that chain of survival. So it's really, black and white. So CARES, these are the funding providers. I don't feel like I have any conflicts. And really the story behind CARES and Peros was we've been working on measure and improve for a couple of years in the U.S. We have a meeting every year that we meet with a lot of collaborators at a meeting called National Association of EMS Physicians. It was in Florida that year. And a colleague bumps into someone in the elevator from Paul Middleton, for those that may know, from Australia, and invite him to the meeting. And he asked us after the meeting, could we work and collect, use CARES to collect data in Sydney? And we're like, well, we never really thought about it. And mentioned that colleague here, Marcus Ong, was working with several others in Asia on Peros. So I remember thinking Singapore is really far away, and they mentioned they were going to be meeting in Valencia, Spain. So we actually met at a hotel bar in Valencia, Spain, and talked about how we might collaborate at this meeting that was going on there. And that was sort of the beginning of a relationship. But essentially both projects are focused on collecting outcomes as a starting point. And that's essentially the idea, measuring to improve care and hopefully influence survival. This is our mission statement. I think it's probably very similar to the focus of Peros as well, allowing communities to get basic outcome measures in a standardized fashion, to do benchmarking, and to really start to be able to do quality improvement, and ultimately, hopefully, to translate into better outcomes. Good news is we've known for a long time. If you look at the date on this slide, it's 2004. This is data from, for those who remember, the Opals Trial in Ontario, Canada, and really showing what really does make a difference when you look at the chain of survival in terms of impact. And arguably the first 3 links in the chain of survival are really community-centric. This idea of waiting for the ambulance, is sort of what we've always thought of over time. I'm a former paramedic, and really the event is sometimes determined a lot before what happens of that ambulance arriving, hopefully even before the first responder. And we'll talk more about that when we look at the chain. But this really has told us this is not new information in terms of where the impact is. Those first 3 links really do make a difference. Obviously, the professional care by pre-hospital providers as well as the hospital care and the care thereafter is impactful as well. But this idea, too, of measuring and benchmarking and feeding back to the end users really is important. You can measure something forever. If you don't use the data, it's probably not going to make a difference. And a lot of communities we work with, we try to get them focused on, A, begin to collect data, B, begin to look at that data, C, begin to act upon it, and really trying to use that and feed it back to the end users. So when you look at the chain of survival, I'm going to come up with my top 10 metrics. Obviously, there's a lot of sub-metrics, and I think there is a lot of pieces that we can focus on. But to try to put this into 20 minutes or maybe 18 minutes by now, I'm going to look at each of these links. More recently in the U.S., there's a report that came out by the Institute of Medicine. This is a group that's supposed to be independent that looks at medical, really medical science and makes recommendations to Congress. Not that Congress is always able to make decisions or act upon them in the U.S., but the idea of coming up with some recommendations. A report that took 2 years to come out looked at cardiac arrest. The number one recommendation they made in that report was actually to develop a national registry for cardiac arrest in the U.S., so we're happy to see that. The other pieces, I mean, sort of look at this as a, as a platform. I would point out all these things are important, and obviously a lot of different things that go into trying to improve outcomes. But the foundation, when we look at cardiac arrest, both in the hospital as well as outside the hospital, is built upon surveillance and data collection as well as reporting. The first floor is continuous quality improvement, and obviously the roof, ultimately trying to improve outcomes, are the three levels that I think are really the focus of this talk. The pillars and everything else really are equally important, but the focus on data collection and measuring and being able to do quality improvement is the impact. So I'm going to try to whip through these. These are the 10 topics that I think are most important. Again, my opinion, and I think you can understand each of these, there's sub-metrics to look at. Some of them may fit into a nice number. Some of them are really mapping data. So we'll come back to this slide in a bit and see if I've accomplished in the time frame going through this. So participation, this is PEROS. Where you see red are some of the countries that are participating. Obviously not all of the country in some cases. Japan, there's several cities, Korea, as well as Taiwan, all of Singapore. But the idea that there's also footprint that's beginning to come on board with collecting data. So I think this is really, really exciting and really impressive to look at. From a continent perspective, a lot of communities are beginning to collect data. Some that have been collecting data for more than a decade, some that are just beginning, and others that will hopefully be in the future. From the U.S., this is our footprint. Where you see green is where we're working with the state coordinator. So we try to train a coordinator, give them access to software that they can bring on additional communities and hospitals. Where you see red dots are specific communities. We're working with about a third of the U.S. population, a quarter of the U.S. population. When we started in 2005, we had one city, Atlanta. It's right above Florida, in case people are not familiar with Georgia. And we collected about 700 cases in a year. We collect that same amount of data about every 5 days. So it's grown in terms of participation. And I think that's really an important metric, is a community collecting data as a starting metric, or do they hope to in the future? When we look at that first link in the chain of survival and think of the first responder, this is pre-hospital care in Belfast, Ireland back in like the late 60s, 1966. This was the team that was responding, and it was originally set up a chest pain unit, or a bread truck as an ambulance, a nurse, and usually 2 junior doctors that would respond to somebody in the community that had chest pain, and they brought this thing along called a defibrillator in case the person went into cardiac arrest, and they showed over time that they actually had a number of events where a patient went into cardiac arrest and they shocked them and they survived. But this was back in the day, the first responders or the first team, they had to get to you first, and then you had to go into a cardiac arrest for them to actually defibrillate. This is today where the first responder is really when that call goes through. So we're really backing it up to that initial call. We're starting much earlier and realizing that we have to engage the community. So you could argue that the importance of the dispatcher and the importance of telephone CPR, which I think you've heard a little bit about this morning, that's really even more important than getting the responder there. Because even the best scenario in an urban setting, you're talking about usually 4 to 8 minutes in the best scenario, and it's usually a lot longer, particularly if there's traffic. If that patient has not gotten active CPR, we're not really helping them. And there's been a lot of, obviously, science and beginning, a lot of questions that were asked this morning to suggest that we don't have the answers, but at least a starting point to say we need to have better guidelines for telephone CPR. We need to collect, obviously, metrics, and we need to do quality improvement on that piece. And linking the outcome data to the dispatch record would be an important metric. Obviously, measuring the actual education of the dispatchers. Why would we think that dispatchers shouldn't be formally trained when people in the community don't know CPR until they've been formally trained? And this idea that there's been a much greater emphasis. PEROS Group has taught a number of providers through Asia, usually in a one-day course. You see here on the left, this is in actually Tokyo, a dedicated dispatcher there, role-playing with a true headset, gentleman in the right, on the red, is on a cell phone, and she's talking to him in real time and role-playing to walk him through the call and actually try to get him to do CPR. So this is probably my busiest slide today, but I do put it down because I think a lot of the questions that were asked this morning we don't have the answers to, but I would argue that we really should begin to measure the percentage of dispatchers that have been given formal training for telephone CPR, begin to look at when we're actually performing this, that we measure how many cases do actually get recognized as a resuscitation when we go back and look at the cases that the field providers have performed. How many times did the dispatcher get the call and acknowledge it was cardiac arrest? Obviously looking at the percentage of cases that instructions were provided, and then begin to look at the time intervals from time to call receipt to the actual instructions being provided, time from call receipt to actually first compression. It does require a lot of effort, but we've seen a lot of communities that have done this. This is actually Singapore data, before and after analysis. Similar analysis has been done in Seoul, Korea, where they did a dedicated training program with nurses in a dispatch center of over 10 million people, and showing that you can actually significantly impact the telephone CPR or bystander CPR rate. A number of people have been trained in CPR, but they need to often be prompted. You know, that patient may have agonal respirations, and they may not recognize that they're truly in cardiac arrest. So the dispatcher being trained and measuring this is really important, and it can impact your bystander CPR rate very quickly when it's done. Next metric I would argue would be the resuscitation itself. We could talk about this for a long time. There's a whole lot of sub-metrics to look at, but really looking at the code summary data. This slide is pretty busy, but this is a first pass we're using with CARES to begin to try to pull actual clinical data from the device into the registry and to look at basic things like how often, what is the average depth when professionals get there in terms of depth of compression, rate of compression, CPR fraction, trying to minimize interruptions, all the way up to much more specific metrics in terms of pre-shock pause, post-shock pause, and the idea of beginning to look at and pull that clinical data. A lot of communities do pull this data in where they have resources and look at every code summary and provide feedback to the crew, but this is something we need to do and to try to streamline this process so you can get a better understanding of what happened when the professional responders got there. We know we should be doing this in the hospital as well, because we can do a better job in terms of the actual resuscitation effort and getting feedback, really more objective feedback. I know there was a lot of talk too about debriefing. Obviously all that would fall under the hospital metrics as well. When we look at the actual hospital care, real simply I would say measuring, as you've heard already in the last 2 days, those patients that are having clearly an underlying STEMI on top of cardiac arrest, the time to reperfusion therapy unless contraindicated, and obviously patients that qualify for targeted temperature management. Those are two low-hanging fruit items that facilities should be collecting, again, as sort of a later link in the chain of survival. We begin to drill down at the community level. This is a busy slide, but this is actual real data from, anyone been to Hawaii? Okay, there's Marcus over there. So this is sort of the busy part of Hawaii called Waikiki. There's a beach where all those sort of, dots kind of almost merge in a line. It's a very, very busy area. And this is looking at using local data to try to understand. There's a number of convenience stores called ABC stores. They're like 7-Eleven in Asia as ABC store is to Hawaii. And this idea of where might they place defibrillators and recognizing where actual arrests have occurred. I think earlier today we heard a lot about using new technology to try to get a potential responder in the field like they're using in Singapore to let them know there's an event next door and let them know where the nearest device is. This would be a first attempt to begin to look at where you might put AEDs in the field by using real data. So the idea of being able to understand where public arrests occur and where you might put public devices, this is something that can be a first step in terms of mapping. This would be another example of mapping data here, where we take data looking at bystander CPR rate, what we call census tract. It's about 3,000 to 5,000 people in the U.S. That have been predetermined into like neighborhoods, and we'll measure the bystander CPR rate and then sort of show it graphically. This is actually Atlanta, where I live, in the middle of this I don't know if I have a pointer here, but the middle of the slide where it goes from dark red to light red is the city of Atlanta. The north part of the county is a much different demographic socioeconomically than the southern part of the county. And as you can see, much more people are doing bystander CPR. So when you have this level of data, you can begin to understand where you might target intervention and begin to look at which neighborhoods is no one doing bystander CPR and where might you put resources if you have a finite amount of resources to apply. So again, another mapping example. This is actually mapping 29 cities worth of data, same level census tract, and really we showed in this article was that race and income really impact your likelihood of getting bystander CPR. If you have a 50% less likelihood in these 29 cities worth of data to get bystander CPR in a predominantly African-American census tract compared to a Caucasian census tract. Same thing applies independent of race, income, higher income census tracts, a greater chance. So using the data to better understand where there may be disparity and trying to how to focus on eliminating that disparity can come through mapping. And again, this is kind of summarizing using understanding where your participation is, understanding at the neighborhood level where you have bystander CPR or not, understanding where you might put AEDs, and really understanding where there's differences. This same type of analysis has been done locally, in Singapore and obviously in other countries, being able to use that graphically. So next metric I would focus on would be benchmarking in general, being able to have a community understand how are they doing, how is their tree in the forest compared to the other trees. And this would be an example of one site in the US where they did a before and after analysis. This is in the center of the country, for those that may know, Kansas. There's a lot of corn there, not a lot of people. But this was a metropolitan area where they basically did a pit crew approach, a dedicated professional training effort to improve CPR compliance with their EMS providers. And they showed basically over time, where you see orange is where we have national CARES data, and there's really pretty steady overall survival rate, in the 10+% rate. And they did their intervention in 2012, training all their paramedics and doing a pit crew approach, trying to minimize the interruptions in CPR, trying to maximize hands on the chest. And you can see over time there's been improvement. Now, can we prove that it's related to that effort? No, but we can definitely say there's been an improvement and a trend in the right direction. It may actually have been as a result of that initiative. It might be from other conditions, but the idea that this is a community that's tracking their performance and being able to benchmark against the national metrics. These are all the trees in the forest. When we look at CARES data, we try to provide back confidentially. Each community will see their tree, will highlight their tree in red so they can see where they're at. They can see a red line, which is average or median, and then obviously the others. This is looking at overall survival rate. You can see there's a pretty wide variation. We look at what we call Epstein survival, so a bystander witness event where there's a shockable rhythm. There's even much more variation in terms of outcome between communities. And then looking at bystander CPR rates. So we believe this is really helpful when a community gets to understand where they're at and where their peers are at. It may help at a policy level if a community is underperforming and to say, look, we're trying to improve things, we might need more resources. So data can be your friend, and benchmarking can be an opportunity to try to move in that direction. This is an example of using data and following a trend, and we'd argue that doing a trend analysis can help either at the community level or in this case, this is looking at all the communities and CARES that were collecting data in 2010, class 2010, and track that class over time, and to show that there has been improvement, not only in overall survival, but more particularly in the cases where we would expect a greater survival impact, those a bystander witness event, and then a bystander witness event in that blue line where there's been bystander involvement. So the idea that we can track and a benchmark can give you an idea. This is looking in the same class of 2010, but drilling down to bystander CPR rates. The red line is excluding any case that the patient went into arrest after the ambulance arrived, because we wouldn't expect the bystander would be involved, hopefully, in that transaction. The blue line is that same scenario, but excluding medical facilities or nursing homes. And again, this is looking at AED usage rate. Now, important point I'd point out here is when you drill down, the blue line is really public access defibrillation. We haven't really seen, significant changes. The red line is actually showing that there's been a difference when you when you basically exclude, well, actually the red line is including medical facilities and nursing homes. So we think there's been an increase in the use of devices in those specific communities, either in medical offices or nursing homes, because it looks like AEDs are being used in that environment. When you exclude those out and looking at true public, not so much. And again, this is really not to try to put you to sleep, but looking at data over time is, that you can show trend analysis. And the idea is when you're looking at the entire class, we're hoping that things get better. We're hoping that each community improves, but also looking at the collective input into CARES. This is something that, and showing over time that there's been improvement in survival, but thankfully not at the expense of more patients having worse outcomes in terms of the neurological disability did not go down over time. This I want to show real quick because I think some of these slides you saw yesterday. This is sort of showing an unadjusted trend analysis. Each year we have new sites come on board, but just kind of looking at a trend and overall survival rate, which is in blue, unshockable, which is in green, but keep your eye on the red line and just look at that sort of trajectory. This is CARES communities over time. These slides are what you saw with Jerry Nolan. See that sort of overall trend, kind of slope is similar, different set of years, but the same idea. This is the Danish data set. But the idea is over time, there seems to be a trend in the right direction. It doesn't necessarily mean that it has anything to do with the data collection process, but the idea that you can at least suggest that there's been a trend in the right direction. And maybe you don't know exactly what caused it, but that's okay. Patients probably aren't so concerned that it's exactly this item or that item. They just want to know that you've provided hopefully the better level of care over time. And this is even older data in Japanese Epstein registry. So again, showing that when you collect data over time and you do a trend analysis, that's something you'd hope for. There's obviously a lot of things that could be influencing it, but at least that's what you'd hope for. So again, back to this original slide, really tried to suggest that measuring participation, focusing on those initial links in the chain of CPR being really important, hospital level care, and then really looking at when we have enough data over time, measuring disparity, being able to benchmark, and then a trend analysis. So I think I'm actually, I have 2 minutes. Wow, that never happens. Okay. Okay. Well, actually, I know we're going to answer questions here, but I'm kind of curious in the audience, how many pre-hospital providers here? Excellent, excellent. How many nursing providers? Okay. Physicians? Okay. What categories have I not hit on? Any telecommunicators or dispatchers? Dispatchers. I love that slide this morning. There was like 20 different ways to say dispatcher CPR and then others. But I think, my background, as I may have mentioned, prior to going into, emergency medicine, I was a paramedic in the field. And I think you begin to realize over time, it's not even about the ambulance getting there. It's really about getting the community engaged, getting that dispatcher engaged, and then all the other steps after are equally as important. But if we have a really great opportunity, and I know you've heard this a couple times already in the session, it isn't about the next device. It's not about the next drug. It's about the basics. It's about measuring, and it's about getting people to do CPR and using that first contact. That's where the real opportunity is. Continuing to measure the care that happens after that is important, but that's what I think will make a difference in the next, foreseeable future, and that's a great opportunity, particularly for communities that are just beginning to measure. That's a quick way to go from a 10 or 15% bystander CPR rate to a 30 or 40% in a short amount of time. It's really hard to train millions of people in CPR. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but it's a lot easier to focus on trying to engage the dispatcher and really empower them. So I think there's a great opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Bryan.